Most gardeners treat their food garden like a seasonal reset button, ripping everything out, starting over and, well, wondering why yields stay average. That approach wastes time, strips soil biology and locks the garden into constant input mode. The real consequence shows up after a few seasons: declining soil structure, inconsistent harvests, and more dependence on fertilizers just to maintain baseline production. Perennial crops flip that entire system. They build soil instead of draining it, and they produce more with less intervention every single year. Perennials are not just plant once and forget. That's where most advice goes wrong. These crops demand strategic placement, proper spacing, and controlled pruning to reach their full potential. A poorly placed asparagus bed will underperform for decades, while one set in deep, loose soil with proper spacing can yield heavily for 20 years or more. The same applies to rhubarb, artichokes, and even perennial herbs like thyme and oregano. The difference is not the plant, it's the system built around it. That system depends heavily on maintenance, and this is where a tool like the Felco F2 pruning shears becomes essential. It's linked in the description below. These are not just any pruners, they're precise enough to make clean cuts that heal quickly, reducing disease entry points on long-living plants. But the product is available on Amazon, and, well, this content uses affiliate links, meaning a small commission may be earned at no extra cost, helping support a dog rescue organization. That same organization depends entirely on donations to rescue, feed, and treat abandoned and injured dogs. Anyone finding value here and feeling moved by the mission can contribute in any way possible, because even the smallest donation directly helps save lives. That connection matters, because building something sustainable, whether a garden or a rescue effort, comes down to consistent care over time. Start with asparagus, because it really sets the tone for how perennials should be treated. A proper bed requires at least 30 centimeters of loose soil depth, enriched with compost at a ratio of about 3 parts native soil to 1 part organic matter. Crowns should be spaced 30 to 45 centimeters apart in rows at least 1 meter apart. Cutting too early weakens the plant, so harvesting should only begin lightly in year 2, then fully in year 3. This patience pays off with decades of production. Rhubarb thrives under similar long-term thinking, but, prefers slightly heavier soil with strong moisture retention. Plant crowns so that the top sits just 2 to 3 centimeters below the surface. Over-harvesting is the biggest mistake here. Removing more than a third of stalks at once will stress the plant and reduce future yields. Regular division every 4 to 5 years keeps productivity high. Jerusalem artichokes are often treated like weeds, and, well, that's exactly why they outperform expectations. You should plant tubers about 10 centimeters deep, with at least 60 centimeters spacing between them. If left unmanaged, they will spread aggressively. Controlled harvesting, combined with cutting back stalks at about 1.5 meters, really helps redirect energy into tuber development. This is where sharp pruning tools again make a difference, especially when you need to cut thick stalks cleanly without crushing them. Horseradish follows a similar pattern, but honestly, it requires even stricter control. Any root fragments left behind will regrow, so harvesting must be deliberate. It's best to plant root cuttings at a 45-degree angle, about 10 centimeters deep, and always harvest the largest roots while leaving the smaller ones to regenerate. That cycle, you'll find, creates a continuous supply. Moving into leafy perennials, sorrel is one of the fastest return crops you can grow. Seeds germinate quickly, but once established, these plants return year after year with minimal care. Regular cutting encourages fresh growth, and removing flower stalks early on extends the harvest window significantly, Kale, when treated as a perennial in mild climates, becomes a completely different plant altogether. Instead of harvesting the entire plant, you should remove lower leaves continuously while allowing the top to grow. Over time, this creates a sort of tree-like structure that can produce for multiple seasons. Clean cuts with a quality pruner really do prevent stem damage and reduce the risk of disease. Walking onions multiply themselves in a way that most crops simply don't. Instead of relying on seeds, they produce bulbils at the top, which fall and replant themselves. Managing density is critical. If left untouched, overcrowding reduces bulb size and vigor. Thinning every season ensures strong growth. Chives and garlic chives are often underestimated, but consistent cutting transforms them into high-yield producers. Cutting down to about 5 centimeters above the soil every few weeks triggers fresh growth. Allowing them to flower occasionally supports pollinators without significantly impacting production. Artichokes demand more space but reward it heavily. Each plant can spread up to 1.5 meters, so spacing must reflect that. Deep watering once or twice a week encourages strong root systems, while shallow watering leads to weak growth. Cutting spent stalks at the base redirects energy into new bud formation. Globe artichokes and cardoons share similar needs but differ in harvest approach. Cardoons are grown for their stalks and require blanching by wrapping them for a few weeks before harvest to reduce bitterness. This extra step separates average growers from serious ones. Berry crops define the backbone of perennial systems. Raspberries, for example, require an understanding of cane cycles. Summer-bearing varieties produce on second-year canes, while ever-bearing types produce on first-year growth. Cutting the wrong canes eliminates the next harvest. Using reliable pruners ensures accurate cuts, especially when managing dense patches. Blackberries follow a similar structure but often require trellising. Without support, they become tangled and unproductive. Training canes horizontally increases light exposure and fruit production significantly. Strawberries are technically short-lived perennials, but, managing runners correctly really extends their life. Allowing too many runners actually weakens the mother plant. Limiting each plant to 3 to 5 strong runners maintains both expansion and productivity. Now, blueberries demand acidic soil, typically in the pH range of 4.5 to 5.5. Without this, yields drop sharply. Mixing peat moss or pine bark into the soil at planting helps establish the right conditions, and mulching with wood chips maintains moisture and acidity over time. Moving underground again, perennial leeks and multiplier onions provide continuous harvests when managed correctly. Dividing clumps annually prevents overcrowding and keeps bulb size consistent. Herbs bring consistency to perennial systems. Rosemary, thyme, sage, and oregano actually thrive on neglect more than attention. Overwatering is the most common mistake. These plants really prefer well-drained soil and minimal feeding. Cutting them regularly prevents woody growth and keeps flavors strong. Mint, on the other hand, needs containment. Planting it directly in the ground without barriers leads to complete takeover. Using containers or buried edging controls its spread while maintaining production. Tarragon, especially French tarragon, must be propagated through cuttings rather than seeds. Dividing plants every few years keeps them productive and prevents decline. Lovage is often overlooked, but, it produces celery like stalks with far less effort. Once established, it requires almost no care beyond the occasional cutting. Perennial spinach varieties, such as tree spinach and longevity spinach, provide continuous leafy harvests. Regular cutting promotes branching and increases yield over time. In hydroponic systems, perennial crops behave a bit differently, but they remain highly productive. Herbs like basil, mint, and oregano can, be maintained almost indefinitely with the right nutrient balance. Electrical conductivity levels around 1.5 to 2.0, along with consistent pruning, keep these plants in a vegetative state. Just remember, cutting too aggressively without giving enough recovery time really stresses the system, so timing definitely matters. Even fruit trees can be integrated into smaller spaces if you use dwarf varieties. Pruning becomes, honestly, even more critical here, shaping the tree for better airflow and sunlight. This is another point where high-quality pruning tools consistently outperform cheap alternatives, especially when you're making repeated cuts across several seasons. Grapes, figs, and even dwarf citrus can function as perennial backbone crops when managed correctly. Grapes, for example, require aggressive pruning each year to maintain productivity. If you leave too many canes, fruit quality drops. Figs actually produce on new growth, so cutting back annually encourages much better yields. Citrus needs balanced feeding and protection from extreme conditions, but it really rewards consistency with long-term harvests. Perennial systems aren't about doing less work. They're about doing smarter work that, well, compounds over time. Each season builds on the last instead of just resetting. The soil improves, plant health stabilizes, and harvests become more predictable. The difference between a struggling garden and a thriving one often comes down to how well these perennials are maintained. Clean cuts, proper spacing, and disciplined harvesting all help create a system that produces without needing constant intervention. That's why tools like the Felco F2 pruning shears keep coming up in serious gardens. Precision, durability, and consistency really matter when plants are expected to produce for years instead of just months. A garden built on perennials is not just productive, it's resilient. It withstands drought better, recovers faster from stress, and needs fewer inputs over time. That's the real advantage. So, subscribe and share this with anyone serious about growing better food, because, honestly, knowledge like this compounds, just like the garden itself. And if there's one tool that quietly supports that long-term success, it's a reliable pair of pruning shears that keeps every cut clean and every plant thriving year after year.